Great. Well, Lance, it's nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you too. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. So this is Lance, everyone. Lance is the son of a really good friend of mine, and also someone who works with us here at New Community. Leandra,
Mhm.
she's been our finance manager for about 10 years now, and so Lance moved to Brighton to go to uni, and now his mum's moved down a bit closer to be with you down there in Brighton. So what are you doing now, Lance? You finished uni, yeah?
Yes, I'm currently working in the city in Brighton with a digital marketing agency. So I'm in, I guess my job title is paid media executive.
Excellent, excellent. So we're talking about race and racism and prejudice, and we had a great chat last week, and I just thought it was so good. I just want to give a platform so that we can listen to your experiences and
Hmm.
learn from them and learn together. And so, tell me a little bit about your own background. You moved across here from Zimbabwe with your mum a number of years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think it must have been 2005. We moved over. So at the time I was about 8 or 9 at the time, moving over to England, and I sort of enrolled into a school. And I think sort of, which is something I've mentioned before, but before moving over, I was in a school with majority other black students. It was a mixed school, so there's black and white, but it was majority black. Obviously, growing up in Africa, I was in the majority for the beginning of my life. So I was aware of my skin color, but it was never something that I was as aware until I moved to the UK. And it started off quite innocently. I think starting off with, obviously when you're 8. Having little kids ask me, is your skin also black? Is your just little things that they were sort of signaling to myself that I was different, and my skin color made me different. And I think it was then that I realized, oh, my skin color must really matter, because it's bringing up a lot of questions from even children, and even people who were my friends in school and throughout would always just ask little things. And I even remember sometimes if they'd see another black person, they'd say, do you know them? Is that your auntie? Is that your mum? Or like just lots of questions maybe that came from quite innocence as a child, but that just always made me very aware I was a minority, because I don't think I ever would have turned around and asked them
Yeah.
if I saw any person who was white, if they knew them, sort of thing, which, yeah, it was just
Yeah.
very clear that I was a minority.
Yeah. And did that turn to any abuse as you grew older, or obvious prejudice or discrimination, Lance?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think with the stereotype of, especially being a man who is black, I think the older you get, probably the more covert it becomes, because now you're not, yeah, I guess your race is now been, the way it's been placed on you is almost as this dangerous sort of stereotype, and all the things that come along with a black male and what they're associated with, especially in the UK with, because I remember growing up, I was made very aware of a lot of the knife violence that was happening in London, and being made very aware that actually when people see you, always make sure that you, like my mum always did tell me to always make sure that wasn't something that I really, as a young man, grew up wanted to be associated with. So I was very aware of the stereotype that was often placed on me. And I think I've sort of shared this before, but getting into a taxi, ordering a taxi with a man who sort of said when I arrived in the car, I wasn't expecting you to be black. I thought from the phone you were going to be white because you're so well spoken. And he sort of then complimented me, saying, you speak very well for a black man and very articulate. And I think looking back at that instance, I realized the intent was probably quite innocent and he probably meant well. But the impact on myself was quite negative, because I then took away that for a black person, you're not meant to be articulate. You're not meant. Your stereotype is that you're uneducated. You maybe speak whatever way that I think is pushed out there, and actually speaking articulate is only something that it's a white trait. And even thinking of it and saying it out loud, you almost think, what does sounding black or sounding white even mean? It doesn't sort of mean anything.
Yeah. So I mean, what did you do with that stuff? Where did it go? You know, did you just internalize it all? Did you talk about it with your mom? You know, what did you do with that stuff?
I'd say definitely up until recently, a lot of it definitely was just swallowed. Even in that instance, and many of the other instances, I would just swallow it to a point where I think for survival, because at the time it was very aware that it sometimes felt like this is as good as it's going to get. Race, I mean, there was a whole civil rights movement and all that happened that pushed us forward. But I definitely never believed there was going to be another revolution with it and another push. So it was just almost like, this is life now. There's no point dwelling on it because it will just consume you. So for survival, I think you just put it in a place where maybe you yourself forget, which is why I think a lot of Black people in the UK must be experiencing a lot of stuff coming up right now that they've even forgotten about because they just hadn't given those experience of voice or any sort of recognition. And I think now that the world is awakening to them, I think so are those experiences inside myself anyway, actually saying, actually, no, this was really painful and this is still here and I haven't really dealt with it. So I think that's probably where also the massive uproar is coming from as well amongst the Black community.
I mean, you've done a lot of reading around race and racism. What are some of the things that you've learned, Lance, over these years as you've explored some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely learned that racism isn't just one-dimensional. I mean, really even trying to understand it is such a concept that because of its foundations of 4 decades ago, has now been ingrained and been, from that foundation, has been slowly built up. Yes, of course, it might have been watered down, but a lot of its core heart is still can be found a lot in society. And just learning that actually there is systemic racism, there's institutional racism, there's interpersonal racism, which is the racism that a lot of people see in films where maybe people are using racial slurs, or it's very much like racism placed on one person, racism placed on one individual to another and their views, expressing it in that way. But also, quite sadly, there's internalized racism, which is almost the racism that you experience of obviously being in a society where it's almost everywhere. You, just like secondhand smoke, you inhale it, and almost you start to believe that you are less than, and there's only so much you can achieve and there's so much that's expected of you, that actually I feel as a Black community you start putting yourself in that box that society so wants you to be in a lot of the time.
So what do you hope will come of this current moment that we find ourselves in, Lance?
I think for me, one thing, even when I pray about this to God, it's definitely for longevity and actual change. And I think the sort of Bible verse, like a man, like what you think, almost, it's quite well known now more for a quote, but you are what you sort of think, what you think is what you become. I think a lot of what I want to see change from the longevity is heart change. As I think a lot of people know about racism, but I think knowing doesn't always transcend to the heart. And I think once your heart understands something, I think that's when action comes from it, where almost you don't have to think about it. Because I'm sure a lot of white people are thinking, oh, I really want to make sure I'm intentional about this. And I think once you understand it in your heart, it doesn't have to be something that you actively have to always think about every time you interact with a Black person, but just because your heart understands it and your heart sees that the human nature of it and the human pain that lies within it, you'll almost naturally not do the right thing. Because I don't think, even along this journey, people, I think one thing to understand is I don't think everyone will get it right, but it's when they do get it wrong to apologize and to then sort of correct it. But I definitely think what I'd like to see is almost, I've heard the term positive discrimination, which is, you know, people discriminating in a positive way. And even though it almost sounds like, because then it does the common debate that you hear of people saying, oh, but how's that fair and everyone that you're not positively discriminating against? But I think it's also in recognizing that for so long, a lot of Black individuals and people of color have been negatively affected by the way that racism has seeped into society, that we actually have to make this race equal. We have to make the leverage equal. And the only way to do that is to actively put things in place to make sure it's equal to a point, because I'm sure I can speak for myself. I'm, as a black person, I never say I want more than a white person. I just want the same as them. I want to be seen as the same. I want the same opportunities to walk into a room and know this can be mine just the same as it can be anyone else's. So I think putting things in place to actually allow that to happen.
So as a white, middle-aged church leader, what do you want to say to me in regards to how the church can better accommodate, better listen, better speak up, better act? You know, what advice do you want to give?
I think on that, I would definitely say, from my experiences anyway, and this is just to churches all around, I think being in a society where you walk in and instantly, as the majority, you have to understand the way as a minority, the way the majority work. It's almost the same in churches, and the way that churches sort of, how just culturally, set aside race, but just as a Western world, how they worship or how they do church. You, as a black person, you walk in and you have to understand it. I think as general church leaders, it's also putting the effort to understand the other way around, and then saying, you understand us, we now want to understand you. And the things, for example, I can give you an example. I was once at a Christian festival and I saw a black woman who was African, and she had sort of like a little shaker, and it's a traditional African thing, and she was sort of using it during worship, and that was her worship. But a lot of people around her were almost, without saying it, but almost trying to shush it and trying to almost say there's no place for this here. And I don't think, again, it was intentional or anything that was meant to be racist, but it's then understanding that this is this woman's way of worshipping and making space for that, and almost to the point where it then everyone can bring themselves to God and actually allow themselves to be authentically who they are in the church, in the sense that they can worship how they might want to be. So I think that is one thing I would definitely say to church leaders is, and I think it won't be easy to create a culture where that is a thing where maybe black people can feel like I can be myself here, because a lot of the time, you'll find there's a lot of black churches and white churches, or that term where I know myself. Some of my friends say I go to a black church, and a lot of that time that means my experiences there can be understood. I can fully express myself, and it's in a way that relates back to myself. Rather than going somewhere where maybe due to culture, maybe more than anything, but you maybe don't identify with everything that's done and everything that's spoken so much as everyone else, maybe.
Wow, Lance, thanks for that. That's fantastic to hear. You're so articulate and clear, and let's believe that together, this season, this moment won't just become something that we react to, but that we respond to in a healthy and a positive way. And so thank you for taking the time to speak, and we want to just create spaces to listen more and more. So bless you, Lance. Thanks for that.
No, thank you for creating this platform. And you're doing exactly what I think a lot of people who are black would definitely feel. You're giving that space to firstly listen and understand it for yourself, to see what you can actually do. So that's really great. Thank you.
Yeah, bless you, Lance. Thanks then.